The story begins with several children walking through a huge field while talking about a man who recently arrived from Tokyo. The main topic among them is Yatero, considered the most admired boy at school because of his family's wealth. According to the rumors, the visitor came specifically to invite him to live in Tokyo. Curious and excited to find out who the man was, the children ask Yad to take them to the house where the visitor is staying. On the way, they pass by a farm where Kabane Kusaka, a 13-year-old boy, is working. As soon as they see him, they start mocking him, calling him Dorotabou, a nickname tied to a Japanese folklore creature from the rice fields. The children use that name to humiliate Kabane because he is always covered in dirt and smells bad from working so hard in the fields. Yad then yells at him to stay away from his house, saying he does not want the visitor to deal with someone as weird as him. Even after hearing that, Kabane calmly stands up and says he will be careful not to bother anyone. Soon after, the scene shifts to reveal the visitor from Tokyo. His name is Kohachi Inugami, a private detective who specializes in strange cases. We learn that he had a small accident on the road after one of his tires blew out. His client and host, Mrs. Kusaka, the owner of Kanoko Village, personally comes to pick him up and take him to the farm. During the ride, she explains that several animals have started appearing dead and rotting for unknown reason. Everything happened so quickly that the villagers began believing something terrible was attacking the village. The woman fears there may be a killer behind the massacre, leaving everyone terrified. Even with the situation getting worse, Mrs. Kusaka chose to hide the problem from the children to avoid causing panic and to keep them attending school. Her biggest wish is for Inugami to secretly uncover the truth without damaging the farm's reputation among the villagers. When they arrive at Kanoko Village, the woman pays for the repairs on Inugami's vehicle. At that moment, the children appear again, trying to gather the courage to speak to the visitor from Tokyo. However, they get nervous and quickly back away. Even so, Inugami's attention is drawn to Kabane. The detective walks over to greet him, but the boy only gives a polite bow and avoids talking. Because of that attitude, Inugami assumes Kabane is just a shy boy used to hard work. He then asks Mrs. Kusaka if the boy goes to school, since his rough appearance makes it seem like he lives as an exploited worker. The woman avoids answering and says she will talk about it later. That night, Inugami decides to relax in the village hot springs. While they talk, she says she will take care of everything he needs during his stay. She then reveals her dream of leaving the countryside and moving to Tokyo, imagining a life full of fun and excitement. However, Inugami shows little interest in hearing about those plans. Instead, he changes the subject to Kabane, that the boy got the nickname Dorotabou because he spends all day working in the dirt and mud. She also mentions that Dorotabou is the name of a spirit connected to old Japanese rural legends. After hearing that, Inugami becomes very interested and says the story is extremely intriguing. Some time later, the detective looks for Mrs. Kusaka again to ask for the real name of the boy who helped him at the hot springs. Without them noticing, Kabane secretly approaches to listen to the conversation. Deep down, he believes he will finally receive some praise or maybe even an invitation to go to Tokyo. However, his expectations quickly disappear when Inugami asks for help dealing with the Dorotabou the following day. Clearly irritated, Mrs. Kusaka passes the message along to the protagonist. The problem is that Kabane has never done that kind of task before, but she still demands that he figure it out on his own. After spending hours struggling through the work, Kabane takes a bath to clean himself and brings breakfast to the detective's room. During the meal, Inugami finally properly introduces himself and explains that he investigates supernatural phenomena. He reveals that Mrs. Kusaka hired him to uncover the truth behind the animal deaths and that he plans to question everyone in the village. Kabane then asks whether he found anything strange during his investigation in the fields. However, Inugami avoids answering directly so he does not ruin breakfast. The detective comments that nobody can eat near Kabane because of his strong smell, although he realizes that is just an excuse the villagers use to avoid him. Even so, Inugami shows that he does not care at all and casually stays close to the boy. Very quickly, Kabane realizes the case involves the corpses found on the farm. Surprised, Inugami asks how he figured that out. since Mrs. Kusaka guaranteed that no children knew about the massacre. Kabane then reveals that he is the one responsible for burying all the dead animals. According to him, it started with only 6 bodies, but many more appeared afterward. Some chickens were found with their organs ripped out, making the boy believe that maybe a monster was involved. Kabane also mentions that the bodies always appear after the new moon. Because of that, he believes something terrible will happen again on the next moonless night. After hearing this information, Inugami immediately realizes that Kabane may be the key to solving the mystery. He then checks the calendar and discovers there are only 5 days left until the next new moon. During that time, Inugami begins accompanying Kabane in his work around the farm to better understand the situation. This growing closeness makes Yad jealous, since he cannot stand seeing the boy he used to bully receiving all of the detective's attention. As the days pass, Kabane and Inugami end up forming a very close friendship. Then, one morning, the detective notices a strange pendant hanging around the boy's neck. The object contains a stone that looks similar to a fetus. Kabane explains that he has kept the charm since he was a baby and believes it was left behind by his parents before they abandoned him. After hearing that, Inugami becomes even more interested and asks to examine the stone up close. After carefully analyzing it, he realizes it is an extremely rare life stone created only under very specific conditions. According to him, the object has a composition unlike any ordinary stone. On top of that, Inugami says such a valuable charm would never be given to just any child. Because of this, he begins to suspect there is an important reason why Mrs. Kusaka took Kabane in all those years ago. The detective also says that maybe the boy's parents never truly abandoned him. He then comments that if Kabane wants to learn the truth about his family, all he has to do is hire him to investigate their whereabouts. Kabane has never considered that possibility before, so he is left completely speechless by the idea. A short time later, the night of the new moon finally arrives. Kabane waits for Inugami so they can investigate the animal attacks. However, before that happens, Yad shows up furious and starts blaming him for ruining his dreams of going to Tokyo. He grabs Kabane by the clothes and says he is nothing but a burden to everyone around him. He also reminds him that he is an orphan and claims his aunt only took care of him out of obligation because they were related. After enduring humiliation for so long, Kabane finally loses his patience and stands up to his cousin for the first time. At that moment, Yad rips the charm from his neck. Consumed by rage, Kabane throws an incredibly violent punch straight into his face. Right after the hit, Kabane's body begins to completely change, revealing a monstrous and partially demonic appearance. The moment Yad sees the terrifying transformation, he panics and desperately runs into the forest. Some time later, Kabane recovers his charm from the ground and returns to normal. Even so, he decides to run away from the farm, believing his aunt will turn against him after what happened. Later, Inugami searches the area for the boy until he finally finds him hiding behind a lumber mill. Kabane immediately warns him not to come any closer, convinced that he is the real monster responsible for the animal deaths. However, completely ignoring his words, Inugami approaches without fear and demands to see his back. Hearing that, the protagonist becomes completely confused, so Inugami decides to explain the situation more clearly. Without showing any embarrassment, he lowers part of his clothes and reveals something unexpected, a huge animal tail hidden behind his body. He then explains that since ancient times, creatures known as Kemono have lived among humans without being noticed. These beings possess animal traits, but they can speak, act, and live like ordinary people. According to Inugami, most Kemono avoid getting too involved with humans. However, over time, some formed closer bonds than they should have. As a result, children began to be born from the union between humans and these supernatural creatures. These hybrids are called Ono. After that, Inugami reveals that Kabane is one of those hybrids, the child of a human and a ghoul connected to a koala. Because of this, he calls him a bloodless demon. Right after, the detective admits that he is not completely human either, revealing himself to be a tanuki, a creature similar to a supernatural raccoon dog. To prove he is telling the truth, Inugami summons supernatural flames around his own body. Within seconds, the fire transforms into a weapon right before the protagonist's eyes. He then explains that the life stone inherited by Kabane exists to prevent his monstrous instincts from taking control. As long as the charm remains around his neck, he will be able to maintain his human appearance and control the violent urges inside him. At that moment, Inugami makes it clear that Kabane was not responsible for the massacre of the farm animals. In reality, another creature is involved in everything, someone they still have not identified. After hearing that, Kabane immediately remembers that Yad ran alone into the forest. Without wasting any time, he grabs his axe and rushes off to save his cousin. Meanwhile, Yad runs desperately through the woods, overwhelmed with fear after witnessing Kabane's monstrous transformation. During his escape, old memories begin returning to his mind. He remembers when he was only 5 years old and nearly killed Kabane by accident. Back then, the two were playing near a canal when Yad accidentally pushed the protagonist. Kabane fell and slammed his head hard. However, instead of blood, a white liquid started pouring from his mouth. Too terrified to understand what he had seen, Yad panicked and pretended nothing had happened. Later, during dinner, he was shocked to see Kabane alive and completely normal. After that day, he tried convincing himself it had all been some strange childhood dream. But now, after witnessing the transformation, he finally realizes it was real. A short while later, Yad arrives at an old abandoned cellar. However, the moment he tries to open the door, he is attacked by two extremely violent demonic dogs. Luckily, Inugami and Kabane arrive at the last second before he gets devoured by the creatures. During the fight, the detective explains that those monsters cannot truly die. The only way to stop them temporarily is by tearing off their heads. Even after hearing that, Kabane has no intention of simply watching the battle. Using his axe, he charges directly at the dogs and manages to pin them down with brutal strength. Soon after, he briefly loses consciousness due to the extreme strain. That is when Inugami notices another monstrous creature nearby. A gigantic elk-like beast devouring animal remains in the middle of the forest. The detective immediately tries to kill it, but the creature moves with incredible speed and launches an attack. To everyone's surprise, Kabane wakes up and displays monstrous abilities during the fight. By himself, he practically dominates the entire battle. In one brutal move, he shoves his arm into the creature's mouth and tears its head off in a single motion. Seeing that, Inugami is amazed by the boy's absurd strength and praises his courage. Later, the two return to the village carrying Yad's unconscious body. On the way back, Kabane asks what he is supposed to do from now on, since he can no longer keep living with his aunt after his cousin discovered his true nature. On top of that, he believes he will eventually be blamed for the animal deaths. In his eyes, sooner or later the villagers will see him as a dangerous monster and try to kill him. After hearing that, Inugami says he has already thought of a solution. He then points his weapon directly at Kabane and reveals a shocking truth. Mrs. Kusaka hired him specifically to kill him. The detective explains that the protagonist's aunt knew about his supernatural condition ever since her sister left Kabane in her care. For years, she tried to keep the secret hidden, but recent events made her believe there was no other choice except getting rid of the boy. Even knowing Kabane is innocent, Inugami says nobody in the village would believe him. Because of that, he concludes that the best option would be to accept his fate and disappear for good. After hearing all of that, Kabane realizes there is no way to change his situation. Surprisingly calm, he accepts his death, believing everything will end with a bullet to the head. However, before pulling the trigger, Inugami asks one final question: whether Kabane truly has no desire to find his parents. Even with a faint smile, the boy answers no. In the very next moment, Inugami shoots him directly in the forehead. Sometime later, the detective returns to the village alone while carrying the unconscious bodies of the two children. Mrs. Kusaka immediately worries about Yad, but Inugami reassures her by saying he only lost consciousness. On the other hand, he claims he completed his mission and eliminated the one responsible for the animal deaths. He even offers to dispose of Kabane's body without leaving any traces, guaranteeing everything will be handled quietly. Because of this, Inugami makes the woman believe he buried the boy's body beneath the farm to prevent any supernatural regeneration. However, hours later, Kabane wakes up alive in the back seat of the detective's car. While driving away from the village, Inugami gives him something to eat and explains that an Ano cannot die so easily. On top of that, Kemono possess regenerative abilities far beyond those of ordinary humans. As proof, the bullet hole in the boy's forehead has already completely disappeared only a few hours after the shot. At that moment, Kabane realizes he is no longer in the countryside. Looking out the car window, he sees countless massive buildings lighting up the urban landscape. Inugami then looks at him and says, "Welcome to Tokyo." Sometime later, the two arrive at Inugami's agency, known as the Supernatural Detective Agency. That place would become both the protagonist's new home and his new workplace. There, the detective gives Kabane new clothes along with perfume to help hide the natural scent of Kemono. After that, Inugami leaves to take care of some business and tells the boy to rest wherever he wants. Later, after taking a bath and changing clothes, Kabane remains alone in the office until two other children suddenly walk in. Everyone is surprised by the situation, and the newcomers immediately ask who he is. That is when Kabane meets Maru and Kira, two young people who also work at the agency. Inugami explains that he wants to officially hire Kabane to work alongside them. According to the detective, the agency handles every kind of case related to Kemono, creatures that live hidden from human society in order to preserve balance. Whenever problems involving humans and supernatural beings appear, they step in. The group handles everything from simple investigations to dangerous conflicts and even funeral services involving Kemono. In addition, Inugami calls all the agency members monologues. After finishing his explanation, he asks Kabane to think carefully before deciding whether to accept the offer or not. Meanwhile, Akira grows curious and asks if Kabane is also a Kemono, since he can smell something very unusual coming from him. Inugami then explains that Kabane is an Ano, an immortal hybrid between a human and a supernatural creature. Hearing that, the girl is surprised and comments that Chie is also a hybrid. However, the boy immediately tells her to be quiet and becomes irritated when he notices Kabane wearing his clothes. Because of that, Kabane tries to return them, but Chie refuses to accept any clothes worn by someone he considers smelly. Right after that, he asks the protagonist's age. Kabane replies that he is probably around 13 years old, although he does not know his exact birth date. Hearing that, Chie proudly says he is 14 and claims Kabane should show him more respect for being older. At the same time, Inugami announces that the two of them will have to share the same room from now on. However, Chie completely rejects the idea of sleeping beside a stranger and suggests that Kabane sleep on the couch instead. Seeing the awkward tension between them, Akira apologizes for her partner's behavior and tries to welcome Kabane in a friendly way. She happily introduces herself and welcomes the new member of the agency. However, her expression completely changes when she notices Kabane staring closely at her face. Feeling awkward, the protagonist admits he cannot stop thinking about how pretty and cute she is. However, the moment he says that, Akira completely freezes and starts crying out of embarrassment, reacting exactly like someone caught in an extremely awkward misunderstanding. Right afterward, he reveals that he is actually a boy. Unable to handle the situation, he runs out of the room completely embarrassed. Kabane stands there completely confused about what just happened. To him, Akira clearly looked like a girl, so he cannot understand why everyone reacted that way just because he called him cute. With the atmosphere getting awkward, Inugami simply asks Kabane to try getting along with his new roommates. Meanwhile, Akira takes advantage of the situation to dramatize everything on social media, telling his followers about the terrible tragedy he just suffered and receiving supportive messages in return. In another scene, Chie is sitting in front of Kabane while casually eating a slice of pizza. Even though he is torn between curiosity and annoyance, he makes it clear that the two of them will never be friends because they are completely incompatible as hybrids. On top of that, he says he has no intention of acting friendly toward him. Even after hearing that, Kabane calmly agrees without showing any anger or resentment. That reaction surprises Chie, who expected some kind of argument because of his provocative attitude. Right after that, Chie offers Kabane a slice of pizza. However, he is left speechless when he finds out the boy has never eaten pizza in his life. Without wasting any time, he tells Kabane to try it immediately and even says, "Happy birthday," claiming it will celebrate the beginning of his new life in Tokyo. Chie then watches with excitement as Kabane tastes pizza for the first time, almost as if he is introducing him to some divine food. However, right afterward, he remembers he is supposed to keep acting cold and arrogant. Because of that, he quickly leaves the room while trying to hide his excitement. Later, Akira asks why he seems so irritated. Chie then admits that he cannot understand why Inugami chose Kabane to work at the agency. Akira guesses that maybe Inugami felt sorry for the boy or noticed some special talent in him. However, Chie has no intention of accepting that without answers. Determined to uncover the truth, he sets up a trap using his silk threads in the agency hallway. A short while later, Kabane gets caught in the trap, allowing Chie to suddenly appear and interrogate him about why he came to Tokyo. Kabane honestly replies that he had to run away from home and that Inugami was the one who brought him to the agency. After hearing that, Chie mocks the boy by saying his family simply abandoned him. But Kabane immediately denies it. He then tries to stand up, but Chie warns him that his silk threads are extremely durable and that trying to escape could slice through his skin. Even so, Kabane ignores the warning and removes his trapped leg without hesitation, repeating once again that he was not abandoned. At that moment, Chie grabs his arm to stop him, but quickly recoils in shock when he realizes the wound on Kabane's ankle instantly heals through a supernatural flame. After that, Kabane simply comments that he needs to take a bath and walks away, leaving Chie completely confused. The next day, Inugami takes the two boys on a new case, determined to show Kabane how the job of a real agency member works. When they arrive at the scene, they find an ambulance parked outside the house where the incident happened. As they try to enter, one of the paramedics blocks Inugami's path, saying children should not be there. However, the detective calmly explains that they are his co-workers. Although clearly surprised by the answer, the paramedic lets them in. As soon as they enter the house, other paramedics explain that a mother, a small child, and a rescue team member are trapped inside one of the bedrooms. According to them, the situation spiraled completely out of control, and nobody has managed to solve the problem so far. Meanwhile, two siblings wait desperately for news about their mother, completely terrified. One of the paramedics then asks Inugami to personally check what is happening inside the room, warning him that the scene is extremely disturbing. Without hesitating, Inugami removes part of the tape sealing the door and looks inside the room. What he sees does not surprise him as much as it should, although he does look concerned about how much time has already passed since the incident began. Shortly afterward, he allows Kabane, Akira, and Chie to look inside as well. The inside of the room is horrifying, especially for Akira. The victims are covered in thousands of tiny red insects crawling all over their bodies. Inugami then explains that the creatures are called senchichu bedbugs, insects connected to Kemono. Normally, they are harmless and only bite people while they sleep. However, these insects have a very specific preference for certain types of food. In this case, something inside the room is attracting the entire infestation. According to Inugami, simply removing the object responsible would cause the insects to leave the room and return to their nest. However, he also admits that completely exterminating the insects would be nearly impossible at that moment, and saving all the victims would be an extremely difficult task. Next, the detective considers using a technique to harden his own skin and prevent the insects from biting him. However, he admits it would take too long to prepare, and that the chances of success would only be 50%. After a brief discussion, the paramedics are told to leave the house to avoid discovering how the agency really operates. At that moment, one of the paramedics reveals that his partner was completely devoured by the insects in less than a second. Not knowing how far the infestation could spread, he suggests burning the entire house down before the situation gets even worse. Hearing that, the older brother of the family falls into despair. However, Inugami immediately scolds the paramedic for saying something so cruel in front of the children. Even so, the man insists that the victims are probably already dead. After hearing that, the two brothers start crying desperately while begging them to save their mother. That is when Chie offers to enter the room and remove the object attracting the insects. The house is immediately evacuated, leaving only the agency team inside. Shortly afterward, Jihen uses his silk threads to try containing the swarm. At first, his plan seems to work perfectly. However, within seconds, the silk starts being devoured by the insects themselves. Everyone realizes too late that those creatures can also eat the threads produced by Jihen. After the failed attempt, Inugami decides to personally enter the room to save the family. However, Kemono stops him and asks to take his place, arguing that his regenerative abilities give him a better chance of surviving. After a few seconds of silence, Inugami accepts the proposal and allows the boy to go in. Seeing that, Akira immediately protests, saying it is inhuman to send Kemono alone into that situation. But Inugami reminds him that none of them are completely human. Right after that, he explains that Kemono only needs to find the object attracting the insects and remove it from the room. The door is then opened. The moment Kemono steps inside, the entire swarm covers his body from head to toe. The insects even crawl across his eyes. While watching the scene, Inugami explains that because Kemono is a hybrid without normal blood, he cannot be affected by the insects' poisonous stingers in the same way. On top of that, he comments that hybrids like Kemono possess absurd regenerative abilities and barely feel pain. The detective also notices that Kemono shows very little emotional reaction to the horror of the situation. That is when we understand why he never noticed his terrible smell while living on the farm. According to Inugami, the abuse he suffered from his aunt destroyed a large part of his emotions. Because of that, Kemono keeps moving forward without hesitating for even a second. After making his way through the swarm, he finally reaches the center of the room and finds the object attracting the insects. Kemono immediately lifts it up, and at that exact moment the insects vanish from the room as if they had never been there. Soon afterward, he sees the mother collapsed on the floor, finally free from the infestation, while her young son cries in relief beside her. Later, Inugami informs the paramedics that the problem has been solved. Hearing that, the two brothers immediately run to reunite with their mother, who is still paralyzed from the insect venom but soon begins receiving medical treatment. Watching that family scene, Kemono becomes emotional. For the first time, he imagines what it would feel like to receive affection from his own parents. Meanwhile, Inugami silently watches him from the doorway, reflecting on the boy's incredible mental strength. However, he realizes all the sadness hidden inside him was created by an extremely painful childhood. Later, we discover that the object attracting the insects was simply a pair of red shoes. At that moment, Inugami explains that the Sanchichu are drawn to feelings of guilt, almost as if it were a feast for them. Because of that, he concludes the shoes were probably stolen. A short time later, the older brother approaches to thank them for saving his family. The boy explains that they do not have enough money to move out and asks why the insects appeared there in the first place. Inugami simply advises him not to do bad things again, and to return the shoes he stole from his younger brother. With that, the protagonist hands the boy the pair of red shoes. At that moment, the child reveals that his mother is the only one supporting the family, and, because of that, she never spends money on herself. The only shoes she owns were already old and falling apart. Wanting only to make her happy, his younger brother decided to take the shoes without permission as a gift, not understanding that what he did was wrong. Unfortunately, that decision ended up causing a huge mess for everyone involved. Soon after, the boy becomes overwhelmed with guilt, and several insects begin covering his body. The moment she notices that, his mother rushes in to protect him despite being terrified of the creatures. Even so, the love she feels for her son outweighs any fear, but in the end she still suffers the consequences of the attack. After finishing the story, the boy begins crying desperately. Meanwhile, the protagonist remains standing there with his usual blank expression and simply says, "Family," sounding almost like Toretto himself. Sometime later, the group decides to head back to the office. However, before leaving, the protagonist stops everyone and asks Inugami if there is any chance of finding his parents. On top of that, he officially accepts the job offer if it will truly help him reunite with them someday. Hearing that, the detective welcomes him with open arms and jokingly comments that the investigation fees will be deducted directly from his salary. Right after that, Akira grabs the protagonist's hands and says he is really happy to work alongside him from now on, while Chie simply watches the entire scene from a distance without saying anything. When they finally arrive back at the office, the atmosphere becomes much calmer and friendlier. During the conversation, Chie decides to talk a little about his own past. He reveals that his mother was a spider, more specifically a spider Kemono, and because of that, his sweat and saliva can turn into silk threads. After that, the protagonist asks if his mother is still alive. However, Chie shows little interest in learning the truth about his parents. In his opinion, if a mother abandons her child, then she should at least come back to look for them someday. Since that never happened, he believes his mother either died or simply abandoned him to escape the responsibility of being a parent. Even so, the protagonist insists that her parents might still be alive somewhere, trying to find her. However, Kai doesn't want to hold on to false hope because she feels that another disappointment could completely destroy her will to keep moving forward. Even then, the protagonist keeps saying he's sure her parents are still alive. He then comments that Tokyo is full of lights and life, unlike the dark town where she used to live, and maybe that's why she never seriously thought about looking for them. In a way, thanks to Inugami, she finally found a small light capable of brightening her life once again. Hearing that, Kai feels a huge mix of anger and emotion building up inside her. But she also realizes the protagonist is right. As a sign of friendship, she offers him a place to stay at her house from that moment on, although she makes sure to threaten him by saying she'll beat him up if he snores while sleeping. Most likely, Inugami overhears their entire conversation and feels extremely satisfied seeing that they finally started getting along. Later, he calls a coworker and mentions that he ended up adopting an incredibly fascinating boy thanks to that life stone. On the other end of the line, the woman is surprised and asks if the boy represents any kind of danger. Even so, Inugami says he might be their greatest hope. The next day, Inugami tells the boys that he plans to introduce the protagonist to his colleague named Inari Yoko, a woman with a difficult name to pronounce who is also a powerful kitsune kimono connected to the police. In addition, he explains that his detective agency needs to work directly with the authorities in order to receive certain benefits. Because of that, he asks Akira to accompany the protagonist to the meeting with director Inari. Before they leave, Inugami gives the protagonist a lucky charm to protect him on his new journey. At the same time, Inari arrives at the Shinjuku police station accompanied by a mysterious girl who completely hides her face beneath a hooded coat. As soon as they enter the building, the officers start praising the director and fulfilling all her wishes without questioning anything. Clearly, nobody realizes that they are all being affected by a type of seduction spell created through Kemono scent. Some time later, the boys arrive at the train station, and the protagonist is amazed by the huge number of people walking back and forth. Noticing his reaction, Akira tries to reassure him and explains that Tokyo is a gigantic city filled with companies, stores, and cafes everywhere. Later on, they finally arrive at the station and ask to speak with director Inari. Even so, the receptionist officer blocks their entrance, claiming that the director didn't have time to waste on a group of children. Hearing that, Chie completely loses his patience and starts arguing with the man. However, before the situation gets even worse, the hooded girl named Kan appears in front of them and asks which one of them is Kabane. At that moment, the protagonist introduces himself, and Kan asks him to follow her alone. Unfortunately for Chie, the director only wanted to see the protagonist and forbade the others from coming along. This causes the receptionist officer to mock them once again. Throughout the entire walk to the room, both Kan and the protagonist remain completely silent. However, as soon as they reach the door, Kan simply kicks the boy into an interrogation room. Inside, he comes face to face with Inari, who immediately starts asking several questions about his life stone. Right after that, she asks to examine the charm more closely, so the protagonist hands the object over to her. Afterward, Inari explains that the charm is used to control the hunger of creatures. Since kimonos possess the ability to absorb physical, emotional, and sensory energy produced by humans, that energy serves as the primary food source for all kimonos. Soon after, she comments that she never had a good relationship with Inugami. But because they represent different sides of the same coin, they decided to cooperate in order to protect both humans and Kemonos at the same time. However, the protagonist's presence completely changes the rules of the game. After all, if that life stone can truly control the hunger of Kemonos, then they would no longer need to depend on humans in order to survive. Suddenly, Kon appears behind the protagonist and tears his head off without any warning. Right after that, Inari orders her subordinates to store the head and dispose of the rest of the body to prevent him from regenerating again. Because of that, the officers place the head inside a suitcase, and Kon offers to take it to her apartment since she considers Inari a true mother and always intends to support all of her decisions. Hearing that, Inari gently holds her student's face and says she's a good girl. In response, Kon shows an expression filled with nostalgia and happiness. Shortly afterward, Inari reveals her true plan: to mass-produce the protagonist's charm so Kemonos will never have to coexist with humans again. However, for that to happen, everyone involved must be eliminated. Because of this, she orders Kon to execute Chie and Akira immediately. Somehow, Kon manages to completely alter her appearance until she becomes identical to the protagonist. After that, she returns to meet the other boys, who quickly realize that something strange is going on with her behavior. Even so, what draws the most attention is the suitcase she's carrying in her hands. Because of that, Chie asks if that old kitsune did something to him. At that moment, Kon completely loses control and reveals her true identity by transforming her face into that of a monstrous fox. Right after that, she says none of it matters anymore and admits that she intends to kill both of them right there. Soon after, Kon leaps into the air and reveals a massive foxtail, using it to fire a gigantic barrage of fireballs at them. Heading toward the boys, Kon's attack also causes a huge fire that quickly spreads throughout the entire station. Faced with the scene, Chie screams at her to stop, reminding her that there are innocent people inside the building. However, Kei coldly responds that Inari already controls the police completely and that every human who enters that place immediately falls under a spell. Because of that, they lose all sense of time and begin acting like mere puppets. Hearing this, Chie concludes that it can only be a kitsune illusion and also says that he deeply hates that old woman, causing Kei to lose control and intensify her attacks even more to defend her master's honor. With no other option, Chie and Akira use whatever they can find around the station as cover to protect themselves from the approaching flames. As soon as they manage to find a brief moment of safety, Chie asks Akira to use his powers, but he panics and can't react because of fear. At that moment, Chie uses her webs to reach Kon's suitcase, and when she opens it, she finds the protagonist's severed head inside. To her surprise, the protagonist greets her normally, as if the situation were completely ordinary, even though he clearly realizes things are not looking good for them. Meanwhile, Akira faints from the stress, forcing Chie to carry him while also grabbing the protagonist's head with obvious disgust as she tries to escape. At the same time, Chie remembers that if she fails the mission, she'll no longer be considered Inari's good girl. That thought causes her to lose control for a few moments, entering a state of mental confusion while transforming her body to locate her prey. On the other hand, she tries to hide from Kon, but she can't hide her discomfort whenever the protagonist talks to her in that situation. Even so, she still wants to understand what happened inside the director's office. Before explaining, the protagonist asks her to take him to Kon. Chie immediately reminds him that he's literally just ahead at the moment and has no way of fighting her. Even so, the protagonist insists, saying that if he's thrown the right way, he can solve the problem. Chie hesitates for a moment, but remembers the events of the previous day and realizes he actually can do it. So, she throws his head toward Kon. At the exact moment, the protagonist bites Kon's neck, damaging her and interrupting her attack. Right after that, his head bounces across the floor a few times until he loses consciousness, only to recover shortly afterward and return to normal. Chie watches the scene, believing the fire might have been an illusion, but she quickly realizes the truth after noticing a burn wound on her own hand caused by the flames. Afterward, the protagonist asks her to slightly move his head, and when she does, his body begins regenerating again right before her eyes. Confused, Chie asks how he's able to do something so impossible, but the protagonist doesn't understand her reaction. She then hands him her coat to cover his naked body. Even so, she scolds him, saying he acts recklessly and makes it seem like he isn't afraid of anything, even after everything that happened. Despite that, the atmosphere between them gradually changes, and Chie starts growing closer to him. She even suggests a friendly gesture and asks if they can bump fists to celebrate, although the protagonist clearly has no idea how to do it and ends up messing it up. Later, the three reunite with Inugami, who claims that everything happened exactly as he planned. He also admits that he intended to step in if something went wrong. According to him, the plan involved hiding the real-life stone beneath an illusion sealed inside the lucky charm the protagonist had received earlier. In another scene, Inari discovers that the life stone actually transforms into a tanuki doll. Shortly afterward, she receives a call from Inugami, who accuses her of betraying his trust and threatens revenge. At that moment, it's revealed that the protagonist had hidden the real-life stone inside his own mouth. Inugami continues provoking Inari, saying she's underestimating everything, before hanging up, which causes Inari to take out her anger on a taxi and trigger an accident. Even so, she walks away unharmed and disguises the situation as if nothing had happened, pretending to be nothing more than an old woman going out for coffee. Meanwhile, Chie and Akira question Inugami about the danger of going against someone with so much influence within the police force. He calmly replies that it's not a major problem and compares the situation to simple territorial agreements, although neither of them fully understands what he means. To lighten the mood, Inugami decides to throw a welcome party for the protagonist. Chie and Akira end up arguing over what food to eat, and the protagonist, trying to avoid conflict, decides to eat both kinds of food at the same time, even though it's a bizarre combination. Elsewhere in the city, an injured woman walks through the alleys, repeating to herself that she needs to complete her mission. After the celebration, Chie and Akira get sick because of the food combination and regret their decision. Meanwhile, the protagonist follows Inugami, who explains how his agency operates. He talks about rules, agreements, and using lights as a way to attract kimonos and humans influenced by demonic energy. At that moment, Kon appears again to confront them, but she's so injured and starving that she faints before even getting close. Inugami then brings her inside and offers her food, helping her recover her strength while also advising her not to abandon her mission. Shortly afterward, a client named Yuro enters the office, a human influenced by demonic energy who was drawn in by the illuminated sign. He drinks to ease his suffering, while the protagonist finds it strange that there's a bar inside the agency. Chie explains that the place used to be shared with Inugami's former partner before he disappeared. Akira adds that the detective hasn't taken care of the bar ever since. The protagonist then asks them not to talk about the subject around Inugami, because it's a sensitive topic connected to his former partner's disappearance. Yuro, meanwhile, reveals that he's in love with someone he barely knows. Chie responds realistically, saying that maybe his feelings aren't mutual, but Yuro refuses to accept that idea. Akira suggests they help him, and despite Chie's resistance, the discussion continues. The protagonist then shows interest in learning about love, saying it might help him better understand his own parents. Inugami agrees and decides to involve everyone in the situation. However, Kon and others start approaching once again, and the events continue escalating as new conflicts begin to appear in their path. Although Akira wants to try helping, he quickly gives up on the idea after realizing he might accidentally hurt the creatures living in the river. At that moment, a frog with humanoid traits suddenly appears and tries to capture Akira as a host. The protagonist reacts immediately, grabs a nearby metal pipe, and throws it at the creature, saving his friend. Right after that, he apologizes for giving the false impression that those creatures were harmless. The frog then tries to counterattack by stretching its tongue toward them. But before it can hit its target, it gets struck by a tanuki, a raccoon dog that quickly eliminates it. Akira is immediately charmed by the creature's cute appearance and even picks it up to hug it. However, when he does, he notices that the tanuki is carrying a small pouch containing a note from Inugami as well as a vial of blood. The message reveals that the Kemono frogs are responsible for the suspicious deaths in the river. Although they were normally relatively harmless creatures, they completely lost their sanity, awareness, and even their dignity after consuming human flesh. From that point on, they began acting purely on instinct, becoming a real threat to anyone on the surface. The vial of blood, meanwhile, serves as bait, attracting the creatures and forcing them to reveal themselves. After understanding the situation, the protagonist prepares for battle. Before acting, he asks Akira whether he plans to join the fight, since otherwise he'll have to wait alone at the sewer exit. However, Akira refuses to abandon the mission, and remembers how he once wanted to find his brother with Inugami's help. Because of that, he decides to overcome his fear and continue fighting alongside the protagonist. To contain the creatures, the floodgates are opened, releasing dozens of frogs that immediately charge at them. The protagonist jumps into close combat, but Akira ends up overwhelmed by his phobias and backs away, unable to contribute. Meanwhile, the protagonist and the tanuki fight side by side, eliminating the enemies one by one, although they're clearly at a disadvantage since the frogs seem to multiply as they're defeated. In the middle of the chaos, one of the creatures leaps toward Akira, but the protagonist intervenes just in time and saves him again. That moment reminds Akira of his twin brother, who always protected him and kept him out of danger. However, it also made him lose confidence in himself since he never had to act on his own. Feeling weak, Akira decides to turn his fear into courage and finally unleashes his hidden power, freezing every enemy on the battlefield. The problem is that he also freezes the protagonist from the neck down. Even so, he celebrates the result and considers it a victory. Soon afterward, it's revealed that the tanuki was actually Inugami disguised in his Kemono form, confirming that he had been watching over the kids during the entire mission. Elsewhere in the sewer, he speaks with the leader of the indigenous tribe living deep underground, a giant who admits that he lost control of his species. The chief apologizes to Inugami, lamenting the fact that his kind started consuming human flesh and even their own tadpoles. He thanks Inugami for allowing the souls of his people to finally rest. Inugami, in turn, promises to return and hold a proper funeral for everyone who died during the conflict. With the mission completed, Akira and the protagonist take a selfie to celebrate the victory and preserve the memory of that battle. A few days later, the protagonist is cleaning the office when he remembers one of Inugami's warnings: never open the door at the end of the hallway. Even so, he follows the instructions and continues working, trying to ignore his curiosity. However, unexpectedly, someone drags him into the forbidden room. After realizing he disappeared, Chie and Akira go to Inugami and report what happened, mentioning that the last place they saw him was near the restricted hallway. Concerned, Inugami rushes toward the mysterious door as if he already suspects what he'll find. Once they enter the room, they discover the protagonist under the control of a vampire named Mikhail Floresu. To Chie and Akira's surprise, he's known inside the agency as NH, the one responsible for the technical side and maintenance of the office. Although his existence had been kept secret, the vampire declares that the protagonist is now his servant and that nobody can take him away, demanding that he handle simple tasks like opening cans and bottles for him. Without hesitation, the protagonist accepts the situation completely naturally, saying he already has experience as an assistant. Inugami immediately steps in and asks the kids to leave so he can explain who Mikhail truly is. He reveals that the vampire is an old ally and an extremely rare creature with physical and mental abilities far beyond normal, practically immortal and incapable of aging. In addition, Mikhail possesses an incredibly adaptable mind, capable of learning any skill quickly, but at the same time he lives in constant boredom since nothing in the world seems interesting to him anymore. Because of that, he ended up retreating into games and virtual reality, spending long periods playing. However, Inugami warns that he can become extremely dangerous whenever he loses matches or gets frustrated, since his personality completely changes in those moments. Even so, he's considered essential to the agency because he was responsible for creating the website and protecting important information from Inari. Even then, Inugami asks everyone not to approach him unless necessary. The warning, however, is ignored by the protagonist, who later returns to speak with the vampire again. Chie finds him and tries to stop him from being treated like a servant, but the protagonist insists on cooperating with Mikhail. The vampire then proposes a challenge to settle the situation. An arm wrestling match where, if the protagonist wins, he'll be free. Chie accepts the challenge, but gets easily defeated in 3 consecutive rounds. Afterward, she asks Akira to try in her place, but he refuses, knowing he has absolutely no chance. The protagonist then decides to compete again, but he also ends up losing with ease. Later, Chie and Akira report everything to Inugami, who explains that Mikhail was only amusing himself with them and reinforces that he's extremely dangerous, both because of his strength and his unstable personality whenever he's provoked. Meanwhile, the protagonist heads to a store to buy dinner, still lost in his own thoughts. He reflects on how hard he tried to surpass Mii during the match, only to realize he couldn't even scratch the vampire's determination or his hair. That makes him question whether all adult kimonos are that powerful. Even so, he promises himself that he'll continue training so he can protect the new friends he's made. At the same time, he recognizes that Mii isn't a bad person, and feels somewhat grateful to have him as an ally within the agency. In the middle of those thoughts, Kon suddenly appears, literally falling from a tree behind him. When the protagonist instinctively tries to hide his head beneath his hood, she stops him and says Inari no longer needs his head anymore. Kon then sits beside him and explains that her master replaced her with another disciple, hiring a new child in her place. Because of that, she can't return home, believing she was abandoned for being a bad girl. Hearing this, the protagonist remembers his own recent failure and ends up challenging Kon to a fight. She immediately accepts. The two end up laughing while exchanging blows in the middle of the park. At first, Kon fights out of anger, but she's ultimately defeated with a single hit. It's worth remembering that the protagonist cannot feel pain, no matter how powerful the attacks are. Because of that, Kon starts crying and says she's too weak, believing that's the reason Inari rejected her. Faced with the scene, the protagonist has no idea how to react. He then walks over, holds her hand, and tries to comfort her by awkwardly saying that she doesn't need to worry, claiming in a distorted way that any woman would lose to him because men are stronger, and he even laughs afterward. Meanwhile, Inugami is surprised to see Mikhail leaving his room. The reason is that he can no longer play video games since the protagonist ended up injuring something important during their strength contest. The vampire, still weakened, comments that he doesn't recover as quickly as normal creatures, almost as if he's acknowledging his own limitation. Because of that, he needs to rest for about a week, but even so, he offers to help Inugami with the agency's work while recovering. Despite this, his behavior reveals that he also enjoys watching others being tested in the field. Back at the park, the protagonist comforts Kon until she falls asleep. When night arrives, he decides to wake her up so she can continue dealing with her own responsibilities. He then suggests that she stay at the office with him, believing Inugami could handle the situation. However, Kon refuses, saying that because she's a kitsune, she can't live together with a tanuki. Even so, she says she can peacefully live alongside the protagonist and even suggests that the two of them live together in the park since there are plenty of birds there. Despite the unexpected proposal, the protagonist refuses, saying he needs to go buy dinner. Before leaving, he promises that he'll come back soon, which leaves Kon waiting for his return. Shortly afterward, he returns to the office with the groceries, but instead of preparing dinner, Mikhail informs them about a new mission. Chie gets excited and immediately agrees to participate. However, before that, Mikhail wants to test something. Later, Mikhail appears in a room filled with heaters, creating an extremely hot environment. He then begins sweating intensely until he manages to produce a kind of silk camouflage, since his ability allows him to imitate his surroundings in order to adapt. After the experiment succeeds, they understand the purpose of the new mission: to investigate a series of deaths connected to the company Wood Electronics. According to Mikhail, over the course of 1 year, 16 employees took their own lives, causing major public backlash and nearly driving the company into bankruptcy. The following year, however, after a sudden restructuring, the suicide cases simply stopped, which raised suspicions within the agency. Because of that, they decide to investigate what really happened. Mikhail then explains that the group must infiltrate the company and gather information about the mysterious deaths. In another scene, Inugami appears trapped inside his own home, facing a threat involving a bomb placed at the door, along with a message warning that any attempt to escape would result in death. Meanwhile, the kids arrive at the company building. Using their special abilities, they manage to enter through a window, accompanied by an invention created by Mii, a portable vehicle modified with magic called Magnum Mii, also known as the Transylvanian Volatile Bullet. The device can be remotely controlled by Mii and also possesses camouflage and a camera, functioning as field support for Chie during the mission. Even so, she complains, saying she doesn't need help from such an over-the-top piece of equipment. Mii responds that he once worked in the Transylvanian military, but she calls him a liar and ends up attacking the vehicle, smashing it against the building walls. With no other option, Chie continues alone through the hallways to avoid being discovered. During the investigation, she finds a room filled with employees wearing empty expressions, described as puppets on the verge of losing their lives. One of them leaves the room crying and saying he wants to quit his job. Shortly afterward, the company manager, Reike Kaga, appears and takes the employee away for a private conversation. Chie and Mii secretly follow them using camouflage until they reach the office. Inside, they discover that the manager is involved with 3 Kanem sisters mosquito-like creatures responsible for feeding on human brains. The sisters use their human appearance to seduce and manipulate the company while keeping the workers alive as a food source. After being fed on, one of the victims returns to work as a sort of functional zombie without any self-awareness. Chie realizes the entire scheme and decides to inform Mii. After hearing this, the vampire contacts Inugami and asks about the Kanem creatures that feed on brains. Inugami explains that they consume human blood and organs. However, Mii decides to keep Inugami locked up to prevent interference with the mission. He then informs the kids that the sisters don't directly kill their victims, but instead keep them alive as workers with no free will, which explains the drop in suicide rates. After understanding the situation, the protagonist suggests eliminating them, but Chie prefers to act cautiously, especially because Akira fainted due to his insect phobia. Because of that, she decides to continue investigating before taking action, remaining hidden while waiting for another opportunity to continue the operation and capture the women. Mii starts getting bored while waiting for something more interesting to happen and decides to use his vehicle to make noise through the hallways. The sound attracts attention, and Erika carefully peeks into the corridor, eventually noticing Mii's toy. Because of that, the 3 sisters split up to search the building for intruders. Meanwhile, Shiki uses his camouflage ability to hide and tries to reach a window to escape, but Erika detects him first and corners him, threatening to absorb his brain. At the very last second, Mii intervenes with his portable vehicle, electrocuting the mosquito woman and knocking her unconscious. After saving him, Mii suggests that Shiki escape the building to avoid further problems, but he panics and starts having trouble breathing. Realizing this, Mii concludes that Shiki experienced some kind of trauma in the past, which sparks the vampire's interest even more, causing him to treat Shiki almost like an experiment to test his physical and mental limits. At that moment, flashes from Shiki's past appear in his mind, showing fragments of his childhood with his mother. Although he can't remember them clearly, ever since he was separated from her, he has believed those memories were deeply repressed and painful. Meanwhile, the protagonist and Akira enter the building to help their friend, while Mii follows everything remotely through his laptop, analyzing the situation in real time. In the middle of all this, the vampire relaxes on the couch, eating snacks as if nothing serious were happening. As the boys move forward, they run into Momoka, who stares at them with a disturbingly psychotic expression. Shiki remains completely still to avoid being detected by Erika, while Mii explains that the saliva of those creatures has an anesthetic effect, preventing victims from feeling pain during the attack. Because of that, he warns Shiki that he might not even notice the moment his energy starts being drained. The situation becomes even worse when Erika regains consciousness. At that moment, the protagonist contacts him and says he managed to capture Momoka. encouraging Shiki to trust his instincts and telling him that he's stronger than he thinks. In contrast, Miyai tries to destabilize him by cruelly provoking him and pointing out all of his weaknesses. That causes Shiki to lose his temper, and he ends up punching Miyai's spy device while angrily insulting him. In the process, he injures his pinky finger, but that pain ends up becoming the trigger that awakens his determination. From that point on, he fully commits to the fight against Erika. Using his camouflage, he dodges the mosquito woman's attacks while she tries to track him visually. However, Shiki begins spreading his own traces throughout the area, confusing his enemy. He then realizes that mosquitoes are attracted to signals such as sweat and saliva, and he uses that to his advantage by spreading his bodily fluids across the hallway to create multiple fake decoys. As a result, he manages to trap Erika in his web and finishes the battle with a direct strike. Exhausted, Shiki collapses after using so much energy in such a short amount of time. In that state, he remembers Inugami once talking about his parents in the past, something he refused to hear about at the time because he was satisfied with his new life. Now, however, he begins questioning whether he's finally ready to learn the truth about his origins. Soon afterward, the protagonist and Akira arrive and congratulate him on the victory. Miyai also acknowledges his performance, although he gives him only an average score, which slightly annoys Shiki but also motivates him to keep improving. Meanwhile, the Kemono sisters begin arguing among themselves. The group then decides to search for the final sister in order to finish the mission before the organization erases all evidence connected to the case. Suddenly, Ryuka appears and blames the sisters for the crimes inside the factory, proposing a deal to cover everything up while threatening the boys if they refuse. The protagonist immediately rejects the offer and declares that he won't go along with any of it, putting innocent people's safety above everything else. Disappointed, Ryuka decides to sacrifice her own sisters. She then drains their energy, absorbing everything until she transforms into a gigantic mosquito-like creature. Right after that, she reveals her intention to eliminate the intruders so she can continue feeding. The battle begins again. Chie attacks with her webs, but Ryuka easily dodges and counterattacks, injuring the protagonist. He's thrown to the ground, realizing he completely underestimated his opponent. Akira steps in and tries to freeze the battlefield with his powers, but the lack of water prevents his ability from functioning properly, leaving him vulnerable. Ryuka quickly overwhelms him, and Akira ends up seriously injured. Seeing this, the protagonist realizes the responsibility now falls entirely on him. Despite being afraid of failing, he stands up once again and pushes his body beyond its limits, even breaking his own bones while trying to endure the fight. Miyai intervenes and warns him that brute force alone won't be enough to win. He then suggests that the protagonist unleash his Kemono power because that's the only thing capable of guaranteeing victory. Hearing that, the protagonist feels his instincts awaken. His determination grows, and his inner power finally manifests. His hair turns crimson red, and his eyes begin glowing with intense energy. In one swift movement, he tears off Ryuka's legs, forcing her to partially return to her human form while she agonizes on the ground. The protagonist then notices his own strength and realizes he now has greater control over his instincts than before. Still confused, he wonders whether that power comes from the life stone or from something much deeper inside himself. Miyai comments that he finally managed to understand his true essence and that now he needs to learn how to control it naturally. Afterward, the protagonist returns to normal, feeling that the immediate danger has passed. He stares at Ryuka lying on the ground and begging for her life, then approaches her with the intention of finishing the fight. Before he can act, Inugami manages to escape Miyai's traps and contacts him, ordering the protagonist to stop and return to the office, leaving the rest to the police and Director Inari. At that moment, a new agent appears, Nobumaru, a young subordinate of Inari and leader of the Special Investigation Unit. He formally introduces himself and takes over part of the operation. Finally, in order to erase all traces of the case, he uses his ability to completely destroy the Kemono sisters' bodies, reducing them to ashes within seconds. He admits that he dislikes that kind of task, but says it's necessary so the factory director will be forced to take responsibility for the previous incident. Afterward, Nobumaru asks the protagonist whether he feels any pity for the sisters. The protagonist replies that he doesn't really understand the feeling of pity, although he still wonders whether erasing them completely is truly the right choice, since killing someone and completely wiping out their existence are very different things. Even so, he makes it clear that he doesn't want them to be saved, and therefore has no intention of interfering with Nobumaru's decision. Still, he worries about the fate of the factory employees and asks what will happen to them. Nobumaru responds that as long as they're still alive, they can receive support from the organization responsible for handling these kinds of cases. He also comments that the Kitsune gain nothing from reducing the human population, and finally advises the protagonist to return to the office as soon as possible, since there are urgent matters connected to Chiai's intentions. After that, the protagonist says goodbye. Akira helps him carry their friend's body as they walk away. Meanwhile, Nobumaru watches the spy car with some curiosity, and the protagonist calls out to him before leaving, saying he wants to tell him something in private. He then reveals that Inari is still after the life stone and is probably tracking him the entire time. However, he adds that she has no intention of taking it by force, since that would cause a direct conflict with Inugami, something Inari does not seem willing to provoke. He also warns Nobumaru not to trust Kitsune and to always stay on guard. At that moment, the protagonist briefly comments on how some names and situations may seem confusing, but reinforces that it is all part of the story. Nobumaru then asks why he is revealing all of this. To the protagonist's surprise, Nobumaru admits that he does not like his own master, Inari. The confession shocks the protagonist, but he decides to keep it secret and says they may cooperate in the future. After that, Nobumaru calmly says goodbye and leaves. Later, the protagonist and the group return to the office, where Chiai can finally recover from his injuries. Meanwhile, Akira scolds Miai for sending them on such a dangerous mission without proper support from the agency. Miai, on the other hand, claims he also deserves credit, since the experience ended up making the team stronger. The protagonist and Akira eventually agree, because the mission really did help develop their skills. Inugami also acknowledges that Miai's reckless behavior turned the group into something more resilient. Even so, he threatens the vampire, saying that if something like that happens again, he will personally send him straight to Romania packed inside an ice bag. He also points out that missions involving Miai almost never end simply. Miai, however, only teases Inugami back, suggesting that he knows more than he should about dealing with vampires and hinting that he may test his limits again in the future. He also says that he enjoys challenges and likes watching children grow stronger. Later that night, the protagonist cannot sleep, still thinking about the danger his friends faced. He gets up and checks on each of them one by one to make sure everyone is okay. The next day, Inugami and Akira watch a news report about the company involved in the case, which has now been completely dismantled. The protagonist, meanwhile, remains worried about Chiai, even though he knows he is out of danger, and he ends up paying more attention to him than usual. Even so, he feels relieved that everyone is alive and together. However, he soon realizes that he forgot something important, the promise he made to Khan. Because of that, he rushes to the park where he last met her. When he arrives, he finds Khan trapped in a tree once again. The protagonist apologizes for being late, but Khan finds it strange that it took him so long to come back with the groceries. He explains that he had to deal with an important mission, and she understands that duties come first. Hearing that only makes the protagonist feel even more uncomfortable, and he eventually confesses that he simply forgot to come back. This visibly saddens Khan, causing her to lower her gaze in disappointment. Suddenly, 2 rotten koi fish fall from the tree. Khan explains that they were gifts she caught for him. The protagonist is left completely speechless, embarrassed, and unsure how to respond. From the top of the tree, Nobumaru silently watches everything, remembering his warning not to trust Kitsune. He seems to expect something bad to happen between them. Meanwhile, Chiai talks with Inugami and finally decides that he wants to uncover the truth about his parents. The following day, the group heads toward the city of Kinshigo, where Chiai was born. During the trip, they plan to first visit Chiai's uncle, Ako Tademaru, since he took care of him during childhood. They hope he can help them find clues about Chiai's parents. Once they arrive in the city, Inugami separates from the group to take care of the luggage at the inn, while the others explore the area. Inside a souvenir shop, Kan finds a book about an old local legend. The story tells of a poor young man who returned home and discovered that a spider had eaten his food. Even so, he decided to share what little he had with it. The next day, his house was covered in golden webs, and he became rich after selling the spider. After hearing the story, Chie comments that Kinshigo is full of similar legends. At that moment, he notices a little girl silently watching the group from the entrance of the shop, but she disappears shortly afterward. Chie mentions it to his friends, but Akira jokes that he is not interesting enough to attract girls' attention, which annoys Chie. Later, Inugami returns and informs them that he found Akko, Chie's uncle. Shortly afterward, Akko appears and happily greets his nephew, surprising Chie. The group then heads toward the forest. During the trip, Chie hears a woman's voice calling his name, but assumes it is only his imagination. Next, Akko introduces himself to the protagonist and Akira, revealing that he is Chie's father's younger brother and a folklore researcher who specializes in spiritual phenomena. He also says he is happy to see Chie surrounded by friends. The protagonist asks what Chie was like as a child, and Akko replies that he was extremely stubborn and aggressive, practically impossible to handle. Because of that, he was eventually entrusted to Inugami so he could be trained. Chie interrupts the conversation, saying they did not come there to talk about his childhood. Akko then understands that they want answers about his parents. With that said, he begins to recount the ancient legend of Kinshigo, the same story found in the shop. He explains that myths like these usually originate from real events. Back then, he and his older brother investigated the forest and eventually found Chie's mother, who was living hidden deep within the area. However, Akko seems to be hiding part of the truth. But before he can continue, Inugami interrupts and tells the protagonist and Akira that it would be better to leave Chie and his uncle alone to talk privately without interference. Afterward, the boys return to the village and end up sharing ice cream together. A few minutes later, Chiki joins the group, but when asked about what his uncle told him, he reveals that his parents are already dead, making it clear that he means both his father and mother. According to him, his father died before he was even born, while his mother became sick and passed away when Chiki was only 5 years old. He also adds that the trauma haunting him comes from seeing his mother's body on her deathbed. Even so, Chie says that finally learning what happened to his family has lifted a huge weight off his shoulders. Because of that, he thanks Inugami for helping him uncover the truth and, with a smile on his face, comments on it. The protagonist says he still hopes to find his parents alive and that his situation is not the same as Chie's, but Chie replies that way of thinking is strange and that he should not hide his sadness behind a fake smile. Hearing this, Akira quietly interrupts and tells him to be quiet, since their friend is only trying to hold back his tears so he will not look weak in front of everyone else. Meanwhile, Inugami asks Chiki where his uncle is, and he answers that he left him alone near the river, because it seemed like he was going to cry during the night. After that, the protagonist and his friends head to the hot springs to relax for a while. While they are bathing, the door suddenly opens and Nobumaru appears, complaining to the protagonist for not telling him about the trip. He then reveals his true kitsune form to Chiki and Akira and suggests they take a walk along the lake to get a better look at the fireflies. During the walk, Chiki once again hears a woman's voice calling his name, so this time he decides to follow it until he comes across a tree that seems strangely familiar to him. At that moment, he remembers using that tree as a landmark to find his way back home. He then realizes that his house must be nearby, and starts using his memories to pinpoint exactly where it is. As he runs, he remembers the path that led to his mother's old workplace. Soon after, he has a flashback of the last day he saw his mother alive, when she said goodbye to Chie because she needed to work together with his uncle Akko. At that moment, she warned him not to follow her. However, driven by curiosity and by how much he missed her, Chie secretly goes to her workplace to look for her. But the moment he opens the door, he finds himself surrounded by darkness. There, he witnesses a scene that deeply traumatized him ever since childhood. His mother was unconscious and strapped to a large operating table, being artificially inseminated by a massive spider-like monster hovering over her. Back in the present, Chie collapses to the ground after remembering the event that scarred his childhood so painfully. At the same time, Nobumaru and the protagonist enter a warehouse and find several old syringes used for artificial insemination scattered across the floor. Nobumaru then begins explaining several disturbing events involving the Kemono in that region. Some time ago, a product had been sold in human markets, a spider web with healing properties designed to replace rare human organ cells. Obviously, this was not created by the villagers, but it also was not something entirely made by the Kemono either. At first, people suspected human involvement, but director Inari ended up removing all the evidence before anything worse could happen. Because of that, the media placed the culprit on its blacklist. However, before the criminal's identity is revealed, the scene abruptly changes. The little girl from the souvenir shop is seen wandering around Akko's house, but she quickly runs away when she notices Inugami approaching. Next, the detective knocks on the door of Chie's parents' old house and asks to speak with Akko. The two men then walk into the forest to settle unfinished business. At the same time, Nobumaru reveals that Akio Tademaru is the criminal listed by Inari. That is because he tried to use his knowledge of Kemono to force Chie's mother to work for him so he could artificially manipulate her genes and achieve fame and wealth. That is how the so-called healing web was born, a product sold on a massive scale through the black market, but one that would likely have exposed the existence of the Kemono to the human world. For that reason, director Inari intervened in time to shut down the illegal laboratory where Akko carried out experiments on Kumi. After realizing this, Chie remembers that when he entered that warehouse, someone appeared behind him and struck him, causing him to lose his memory. When he woke up, he was at his uncle's house, where Akko told him that his mother was very sick but would eventually recover. Because of that, Chie spent months and years waiting to see his mother again. However, that reunion never happened, and he eventually grew tired of waiting. At the same time, he felt that his uncle was hiding something important, but he decided not to push further and instead move on with his life, since he knew he was dealing with a painful reality. From that point on, he turned his back on the truth and chose not to investigate anymore, eventually convincing himself that he had been abandoned by his parents. Deep down, however, he knew that was not true, and that his mother would never abandon him. Because of that, he ends up blaming himself for not trusting her. After failing to uncover the truth, Chie curses his uncle for everything he suffered through. He then asks Nobumaru to exchange information with him, because his goal is to avenge his mother's death, even if it means killing his own uncle with his own hands. With that said, Chie asks the protagonist whether he plans to stop him from committing that crime, but Nobumaru fully supports his decision and suggests that Chie become his ally, so they can eliminate Akko together. Meanwhile, Inugami talks with Akko and asks about the healing web she sold. He says, "I knew you did everything you could to sell it, but you failed because something mysterious interfered." Hearing that, Akko believes the mysterious force was Inugami himself, but the detective explains that it was actually a woman he knows. Akko then accuses him of ruining her plans to become rich and asks why he did it. And Inugami replies, "You still do not understand how serious your actions are." Akko continues avoiding responsibility. So the detective asks how she came up with the idea for the spider web. She then reveals that after meeting Kumi, she concluded that the legend of Nishiki Umu was real, and that the spider from the story was actually Chie's mother. However, while planning to investigate further, her older brother fell from a cliff and died. Kumi fell into deep depression after learning about the death of her beloved, but by that point, she was already pregnant with Chie. And shortly after he was born, Kumi went to Akko's house because the baby had caught the flu. Akko decided to help his nephew, since Kemono do not have medicine for human illnesses, so he took Chie to the hospital. However, that kind of treatment required a lot of money, something Kumi did not have because she was a creature of the forest. That was when Akko proposed an alternative, using the spider's powers to make money. The idea involved the so-called golden thread. So Akko decided to extract the material from Kumi and sell it in order to earn enough money to provide the human child with medical care, food, and a home. Finally, Akko reveals that the most disturbing part of all is that, according to the legend, the creature capable of producing the golden web is a Kemono. Because of that, she convinced Kumi to produce the material artificially. For that purpose, Kumi ended up being forcibly exploited and placed in situations involving forced relations with various creatures living in the forest, all as part of an experiment meant to turn her into a maternal base capable of generating and testing countless bloodline combinations until reaching a mutant hybrid known as a Kemono. However, during those experiments, Chie ended up discovering the truth about what was happening and became deeply shaken and traumatized by it. Because of that, Akko struck him in the head and created a false explanation to alter and corrupt his memories. At that moment, Akko reveals his coldest and most disturbing side, even seeing himself as a kind of god for having created what he calls the miracle of the healing web, completely ignoring the suffering and damage caused by the experiment itself, including the impact it had on his nephew and sister-in-law. As the anime itself shows, Chie ended up dragged into this scheme without any choice, while Akko only talks about his plan to eliminate disease from the world and achieve immortality. Next, Inugami pulls out his phone and says, "Here it is, Chie, your uncle's confession," because he had been live streaming the entire conversation with Akko so Chie could hear the complete truth about his mother's past. Right after that, Chiki appears and traps his uncle with a web wrapped around his neck, dragging him to the top of a tree while saying, "I haven't forgotten that you took care of me, so I'll make sure you don't suffer when I kill you." After that, Akko desperately begs Chiki to stop his outburst of rage, trying to explain that everything he did was meant to help Kumi. Even so, Chiki does not believe him and warns that any mention of his dead mother's name will result in an extremely painful death. At that moment, the protagonist offers to execute him, and Nobumaru suggests a strike to the back of the neck to end his life instantly. Hearing this, Akio asks Inugami if he truly agrees that children should become killers. However, the detective responds that he has no intention of arresting Chie because he believes in divine justice and understands that this is a deeper issue Chie himself must resolve. Meanwhile, Akira arrives frightened and angry after being left behind in the forest by his friends. Because of that, he starts hearing strange noises and ends up urinating himself out of fear. Inugami tries to calm him down, but suddenly a white creature appears in front of them. Inugami quickly draws his gun and fires, but his arm is injured, and the creature's venom prevents him from using the weapon again. As a result, both of them are captured at the same time by the strange beast. The protagonist, Chiki, and Nobumaru soon find themselves surrounded by a horde of wild creatures. Akko then reveals that these beasts are like Chiki's siblings, direct products of the cruel experiments performed on Kumi. She also explains that even though they cannot produce the golden web, they possess great intelligence and even learned how to imitate their mother's voice. One of them then frees Akko from the trap created by Chiki. The creatures begin speaking with Kumi's voice, telling Chiki that they love him, that they miss him, and that his mother still loves him deeply. Because of that, Chiki emotionally breaks down and starts crying while desperately calling out for his mother. Meanwhile, Nobumaru realizes the situation is practically hopeless. He asks what the protagonist plans to do to help his friend, since he is badly injured and Chiki has clearly lost mental control, making him incapable of fighting against those supposed creatures he believes are his siblings. However, the irritated protagonist tells him to stay quiet and carefully approaches Chiki, who is already kneeling on the ground. At that moment, he asks once more if there is any way he can help. And finally, Chiki asks him to help avenge his mother. Right after that, the protagonist completely changes his attitude and launches into direct combat against the remaining creatures, smashing one Kemono's head against a tree trunk, shocking everyone by revealing his true strength. Meanwhile, Inugami and Akira are overwhelmed by the remaining Kemonos, and the detective tells the student to freeze his own forearm to stop the venom from spreading through his blood. However, Akira panics and ends up freezing half of his own body, completely preventing Inugami from moving. At that moment, the creatures prepare to attack again, but unexpectedly, the girl who had appeared before shows up once more and manages to communicate with the beasts, calming all of their rage. Seeing this, Inugami wants to know who the girl is, but she simply orders them to follow her so they can treat his injured arm. In a scene change, the protagonist continues defeating several Kemonos without difficulty. While Akko watches in horror at the brutal way he eliminates Chiai's siblings. Even so, the protagonist makes it clear that his real target is Akko, and that he has no intention of stopping until he fulfills his goal. Hearing that, Akko realizes his fate is sealed, but still refuses to surrender and decides to use one final hidden card. Suddenly, a gigantic Kemono appears, with overwhelming strength and an imposing appearance, but the protagonist shows no fear and charges straight at it, striking it directly in the eye. Meanwhile, Nobumaru pretends to be in danger so the protagonist will save him, but the protagonist tells him to stop fooling around and handle it himself. Nobumaru then snaps his fingers and instantly incinerates the threat, completely destroying it. Afterward, the protagonist takes off his shirt and asks Chiai to hold on to it, since there are too many Kemonos around and he does not want to lose an important gift from his friend. Remembering what happened when he lost his body after being decapitated by Kong himself. Next, Chiai acknowledges his determination and asks him to destroy his uncle so he can pay for everything he did to him and his mother. At the same time, Inugami and Akira follow the girl to a small spring, where she instructs him to place his arm in the water to neutralize the Kemono venom. After doing so, Inugami's arm recovers immediately, leaving him shocked. The detective then tries to learn her identity, but the girl refuses to reveal her name and instead asks for a favor in return for saving his life and his arm. That favor is to save Akko's life, because she needs to ask him one final question before he disappears or dies. Back at the battle, the protagonist defeats more than 100 wild creatures, including the gigantic Kemono from before. He then approaches Akko, whose arm is already rapidly regenerating, grabs her by the clothes, and throws her toward Chiki, saying he wants to know whether Chiki wishes to execute his uncle with his own hands. As a result, Chiai thanks him for the help and says that he will now take control of the situation like a true assassin mercenary. He also apologizes for his mental breakdown and for leaving all the hard work to the protagonist, confessing that when he heard his mother's voice coming from the creatures, he realized that killing his uncle would not bring his mother back, and that his revenge was only an emotional desire to see her again. Because of that, he starts doubting whether he should really kill his uncle or not. Nobumaru, however, encourages him to finish what he originally intended to do. At that moment, the girl returns and interrupts the situation. But to everyone's surprise, Akko gets angry at her for entering the forest without permission. However, the girl firmly responds that she will no longer obey her orders. Next, she demands to know the exact location of a cocoon Akko created earlier. Even so, Akko refuses to reveal it and warns that nobody can kill her while she still has the cocoon, which only frustrates the girl even more since she still has not achieved her goal. At the same time, Nobumaru begins to suspect that the girl might be Akko's daughter. Chiai then remembers a moment from the past. One night when his uncle came home completely drunk, rambling about his desire to leave his golden web behind as a legacy, saying he did not care if he died in the process because his research was more important than life itself. Back in the present, the girl suddenly feels an urgent need to reveal the truth. Kumi decides to reveal her true identity to Chiai, but she is overwhelmed by the fear that he may see her as something abnormal or frightening. Even so, she promises to tell him the whole truth as soon as they recover the cocoon. At that moment, Inugami interrupts and offers to help, explaining that as a detective, he has ways to locate it quickly. In addition, he reminds her that he owes her for saving his left arm and wants to repay the favor. Soon after, he pulls out his phone and contacts Mijai at his office. He asks Mijai to investigate any strange clues within Akko's records, paying special attention to possible hidden locations where she may have stored something important or unusual. Mijai replies that there is no need to check any files because he already knows every place Akko used to visit, including the so-called Mystic Spring, a location filled with field cabbages. Coincidentally, that plant happens to be Kumi's favorite. After hearing that, the girl immediately runs toward the location, showing that she already knows the area or has at least been there before, while Chiai and the rest of the group quickly follow behind her. During the trip, Kyumi realizes that the spring's healing power probably comes from part of her cocoon dissolving into the water over time. Once they arrive, she tries to enter the current, but Chie stops her by grabbing her arm, worried because she is too small and could drown. He then decides to take the risk himself and dives into the deep waters of the spring. Afterward, he passes through an underwater crack and finds his mother wrapped inside the same kind of cocoon Kyumi had been searching for. As he approaches, Chie is shocked and carefully tries to touch her face, but a sea monkey suddenly appears behind him. Soon after, a pool of blood rises to the surface beside the spring, followed by the creature's head emerging from the water. Chie then returns carrying his mother's body, and as soon as he places her on the shore, Kyumi screams and asks whether she is still alive because of the sensation she can feel. At that moment, she begins explaining her story, revealing that her name is Hot Diru, known as the Golden Spider Web, and that she is Chikui's younger sister. From that point on, the entire situation changes completely, leaving the group in shock over the revelation. Shortly afterward, Inugami and the others arrive at the spring and find the two siblings beside their mother's body. Seeing the scene, Alaska admits that his plan was never to eliminate Kyumi, since Aya, or rather, the golden web, could not be separated while their mother was still alive. He explains that Kyumi was only meant to be a contingency in case something happened to Aya. Next, he reveals in detail his mass production system for the golden web. To accomplish this, he placed Kyumi inside one of Aya's cocoons and hid her within the spring to keep her in a stable and preserved state. However, Chi cannot stand hearing anything more about those experiments and interrupts him with a punch to the face. He then screams at his uncle, demanding that he never treat them like mere research subjects again. After that, he tells Inugami that he wants to take his mother somewhere safe. The detective then instructs him to get into his car, saying he knows a suitable place to protect her. Before leaving, Chikui tells the protagonist that he no longer intends to kill his uncle, because he believes forcing him to live without ever enjoying the results of his work is a punishment even harsher than death. In addition, he comments that Yaku is still involved in illegal experiments, and that Yugami and Inari know where to find him in order to stop his actions. Finally, Chiki holds his younger sister's hand and states that she will also come with them to Tokyo, where they plan to start over. Meanwhile, the protagonist notices that Nobumaru is no longer around and assumes he left for some mission in the city. However, the truth is different, as Nobumaru decided to stay behind and personally deal with Akko. There, he states that her fate was sealed the moment she crossed paths with a kitsune and, with a snap of his fingers, completely incinerates Akko's body. Meanwhile, the group heads to the clinic of one of Inugami's friends, where the detective plans to leave Kyumi so she can rest and recover from the accumulated trauma. Upon arriving, an elderly woman opens the door and immediately recognizes Inugami. Grandma Ona examines Kyumi and explains that her lethargic condition may be tied to a psychological block caused by the trauma of giving birth to different supernatural creatures. Even so, she reassures Chikui by saying that his mother will wake up with time. Afterward, she offers shelter to the group and allows them to use the clinic's beds for the night. As a result, Akira and the protagonist prepare to bathe and rest, while Chie prefers to remain by his mother's side without leaving the room. At the same time, Almi walks through the hallways feeling insecure and hesitant to enter the room, believing he has no right to interfere in that family moment between Chie and his mother. Later, Chie remembers that his first mission was to try curing his mother's illnesses, since from birth she possessed the ability to create healing webs, although she only truly learned to control the power at the age of 3. Even with that talent, Akio always maintained complete control over her, treating her like an experiment. Whenever she disobeyed him, she was mistreated, although he could never go too far because he depended on her as the result of his research. Even so, Aya spent most of her life trapped inside a room in the basement laboratory beside her mother's body. With very few conscious memories of Yumi, she spent her days silently watching over her, and whenever she felt lonely, she would lie beside her mother just to endure the isolation. At certain moments, Aya even considered giving up on her own life, but she always changed her mind whenever she remembered the name her mother gave her, choosing to keep going so she could one day reunite with her again. Later, she accidentally discovered that she had an older brother and began imagining him as a heroic prince from the books she loved, believing that one day he would come save her. Because of that, she decided to endure everything until the moment she could escape and reunite with her mother by his side. Although that never happened, and she continues carrying the guilt for everything that went wrong. While reliving those memories, Chie sees her standing outside the room and calls her inside. She enters hesitantly and asks whether her brother plans to kill her like he did the other Kemono in the forest, since she believes he might hate her for being the result of a strange union between a beast and their mother. However, Chie replies that he does not hate her, because she went through everything alone while he lived a normal life far away from all that family pain. On top of that, it was Aya who kept their mother alive all these years. Hearing that, Aya begins to cry, and Yumi finally wakes up. She immediately recognizes both of her children and hugs them tightly, realizing they are safe. As a result, the three share a moment of relief and happiness, as if they had finally reunited after such a long time. A few days later, the group returns to the office, but Chie stays at Ona's clinic for a while to help his mother and Aya as a form of support. Inugami's older brother, Gami, gives the protagonist and Yakira a new mission. Even though they are sad about their friend's absence, they are surprised when Chie shows up and tells them not to abandon Inugami's office, since she needs the job to support the family. She also says that she wants to help the protagonist find his own family as a way of thanking him. It becomes clear that she is accompanying him, but now with a more rebellious appearance compared to before. Next, she proposes a deal to Inugami, since she has started using her healing powers at Grandma Ona's clinic. Because of that, the detective officially creates a contract so all of them can work together helping injured Kemono who need medical treatment. Even so, Chie opposes the idea of his sister working because she is still too young and could put herself in danger. However, the protagonist convinces him, and he eventually accepts allowing her to use her powers for the benefit of the office. In the end, the girl clearly demonstrates her determination and strong principles. She eventually confesses that she is in love with the protagonist and, without much hesitation, asks if he wants to date her. The protagonist immediately agrees without even fully understanding what dating actually means. Chikwi instantly faints from the shock of the situation, and Akira explains that this is a kind of behavior typical of adults. At that moment, Kong barges into the office, interrupting everything and challenging the protagonist to another fight. However, when she notices another girl hugging him, she becomes overwhelmed with jealousy and glares angrily at Aya. Inugami then cuts through the group's emotional chaos and starts explaining the new mission. He reveals that several women in the shopping district were attacked by an invisible entity that tore pieces off their faces. Aya offers to go to the scene together with the protagonist and investigate the case. Kei also decides to join them, although she is actually more worried about not being left alone with the protagonist than about the mission itself. When they arrive in the district of Jaraku, a police officer tries to stop them from entering the crime scene, but the protagonist explains that they are part of a detective agency. Surprised by how young they are, the officer eventually allows them through and shows them the location of the incident. Meanwhile, Kei cannot hide her jealousy and becomes irritated by how much attention Aya is receiving from the protagonist. Suddenly, a mysterious voice echoes around them, saying, "I understand you, and I can help you get rid of that girl." Right afterward, Aya is lifted by her hair through an invisible force, while the protagonist celebrates by raising his fist, unable to see what is happening. Even so, he manages to communicate with the entity, which calls him evil. The creature then reveals itself and says its name is Katana. She confesses to being responsible for all the attacks in the shopping district, explaining that she wanted to become more human in order to attract the attention of a young man who worked at a store. Because of that, she started stealing pieces of women's faces, believing she could create an appearance capable of winning his love. She insists that everything she did was out of love rather than malice. The protagonist replies that this cannot be called love, because loving someone means caring for them and giving something of yourself, not stealing from others. Katana, however, argues that people in love cannot properly understand their own emotions. She then points at Kong and says she recognizes in her the pain of unrequited love. Because of that, Katana tried to eliminate Aya so Kei could be alone with the protagonist and finally gain his affection. Hearing this, the protagonist asks Kei whether she really ordered Katana to hurt Aya, but she denies that it was ever her intention. Aya, meanwhile, directly confronts Kei and demands that she speak honestly instead of holding back. Kong emotionally explodes and tells her to shut up, admitting that she does not understand what she is feeling, only that there is a strange pain in her chest. She has never experienced jealousy before and cannot deal with it. Afterward, she says she normally has fun with the protagonist, but now everything feels different because of Aya. Consumed by those confusing emotions, Kong transforms into a kitsune and lunges at Aya, trying to attack her. The protagonist immediately steps in to protect Aya, which only convinces Kong even more that she is being left behind. Emotionally hurt, she starts crying and runs away from the shopping district. Katana criticizes the protagonist's actions, saying he ended up hurting his friend, but he cannot chase after her because he still needs to finish the mission. That night, the protagonist and Aya return to the office. There, Aya explains to Shiki that she used her healing web to give Katana a human appearance, preventing her from continuing to steal faces from other women. The protagonist says that, in the end, Aya solved everything by herself since he practically did nothing. Chikwi and Akira are shocked after discovering the little girl's talent, especially considering she is only 8 years old. Before leaving, Aya says goodbye to the protagonist with a kiss on the cheek and seriously warns him not to cheat on her with other women. She says that if it ever happens, she will react in an extremely dangerous way once they grow up together, making it very clear that she will never forgive him. Chikwi scolds his sister, but even so, admits that he cannot stop her bond with the protagonist. After that, the girl leaves. Later, the protagonist meets AI at the park, where she says she wants to become the most important person in his life, although she does not know how to achieve that. The protagonist replies that he also does not understand those feelings, leaving everything uncertain. She simply smiles and asks him to tell her once he figures out how it all works. Meanwhile, Inugami takes Kumi into the forest and shows her a memorial built in honor of her children. After the emotional moment, Kumi asks whether Chie and Aya know about it, and Inugami answers that they do not, because he believes they would not feel comfortable with that kind of farewell. The next day, Aya, Kong, and her twin sister return to the office trying to spend time with the protagonist, but they end up arguing again. Akira steps in and says the protagonist can only choose one person to love, demanding that he make a decision. To everyone's surprise, he chooses Inugami, leaving the whole group speechless. Right after that, the scene completely shifts to Mount Inugami, a snow-covered village inhabited by around 200 Yuka women, where only 2 twin boys are born every 100 years. That's how the story of Akira and his twin brother begins. Meanwhile, a mysterious young man wanders through the streets of Tokyo. Yue, Akira's twin brother. He approaches a group of drunk men asking about Inugami while showing them a drawing of Akira. They just mock him, and Yui loses his temper, using his powers to freeze one of them and scare the others away. Back at the office, Akira cries after finding his stuffed toy destroyed. The toy, named Nissan, belonged to his brother. Inugami suggests asking Mii for help since she had free time because of maintenance on an online game. Mii fixes the toy and even installs an artificial intelligence system so it can talk. Akira is happy, but he also starts thinking about where his brother could be. In a flashback, Akira and Yui are seen playing in the snow. Akira gets hurt and starts crying while Yui tries teaching him to ignore pain so it won't affect him emotionally. Even so, Akira can't stop crying. Yui ends up carrying him on his back, understanding that his brother is more sensitive to pain. After that, a woman named Isama appears and takes them back to the village, scolding them for leaving without permission since it could put the entire community at risk. They are extremely rare and must remain protected. Because of that, the women in the village provide them with everything they need while keeping them under constant watch at all times. As if that weren't enough, the twins never got to meet their own mother, since any woman who gives birth to a boy dies shortly afterward. On top of that, their father remains locked inside a tiny cell, extremely weak and barely able to survive because of starvation. Even so, Yui stubbornly holds on to hope that he and his brother won't end up suffering the same tragic fate as the other men in that world. Back in the village, Yugami gives the two boys 5 bags filled with sand and explains that it's a request from the widow of a sand Kemono who unfortunately died on the beach. Their job is to separate the husband's remains from the regular sand so he can receive a proper burial. The boys are completely confused by the strange task Inugami assigned them. And Chie can't imagine how anyone could tell a body apart from so much sand since everything looks exactly the same. Even so, Inugami simply tells them to do their best and leaves, abandoning the two to face the impossible task alone. Akira accidentally trips over the bags and spills everything, creating a huge mess. After that, he goes through a series of small disasters. He forgets to heat up the noodles for dinner, accidentally breaks a vase, loses track of the cats, and piles up even more problems like that. Chiki loses his patience and yells that Akira is completely useless, causing Akira to burst into tears immediately. The protagonist tries to comfort him, but Akira's clueless and clumsy behavior only makes the emotional situation even worse. Overwhelmed by discouragement, Akira decides to leave the detective agency. He writes a goodbye letter saying he's leaving because he sees himself as a burden and someone incapable of helping others. The next day, he walks alone through downtown Tokyo carrying a suitcase, determined to find his twin brother even without money, believing he might as well disappear into the streets. In the middle of that desperate state, he asks his stuffed toy what he should do. The toy suggests waiting at the airport, making Akira think that the artificial intelligence might actually help him find Yui. At that moment, a man walks past him, and Akira immediately realizes it's his brother, Yui. In another scene change, the story returns to a flashback where the two brothers find a strange backpack left behind in the snowy village. Inside it, among several objects, there's a magazine filled with pictures of Tokyo. As they quickly flip through it, they become fascinated because the city looks like a completely different world where humans and hamsters live together in harmony. Akira immediately gets excited about the idea of going there, but Yui warns him that it could be dangerous since they're still too young. Even so, Yui mentions hearing about a man named Inugami from the women in the village and decides they should search for him and trust him. Back in the present, the reunion between the brothers finally happens. But Yui seems irritated that Akira has been wandering around Tokyo without direction. Akira admits that he left Inugami's office because he feels useless. He enters a shop and buys a crepe for his brother, but Yui coldly refuses it, saying there are more important things to deal with, like finding a place to live. At the same time, Inugami asks the boys if they finished their tasks and gives them the afternoon off after they confirm it. However, he overhears Chie saying that Akira isn't missed by the team and then receives the boys' goodbye letter. When questioned, the protagonist admits that he also sees Akira as useless, although he doesn't consider that a problem. Inugami then advises him to be more considerate of other people's feelings. Meanwhile, Akira and Yui search for shelter in the forest since Yui needs to hide from humans. He asks his brother what his dream house would look like, and Akira says he'd like to live in a castle like the ones in movies. Yui then uses his powers to create a completely illusionary environment, transforming the area into something straight out of a fantasy world. He even offers to decorate everything however Akira wants, almost like a sandbox game. Akira is amazed and wants to post it on social media, but Yui freezes his phone and destroys it. He then says they no longer need human technology and leaves to search for food, locking Akira inside the castle while he's gone. Meanwhile, the protagonist and Chikwi try cooking a meat stew, but the attempt ends in complete disaster, and they start blaming themselves for being terrible at cooking. At that moment, both of them admit that Akira was always better at handling household chores, making them realize they never appreciated his talents enough. The protagonist then suggests they go look for him, even though they have no idea where he might be. Inugami, in turn, sees on the news the image of an ice castle that suddenly appeared in the forest and deduces that Akira is involved. He heads to the location with the help of a GPS connected to Miai's stuffed toy. When they arrive, they find Yui about to confront a group inside the castle, and Inugami tries to stop him with a shot. which doesn't hit due to an ice transformation in Yui's arm caused by a vital stone called Nula. Inugami then recognizes Yui as a member of the Snow Village and tries to understand why he is there, since that stone should not have left its territory. Yui doesn't answer directly, but thanks them for taking care of his brother all this time. He then triggers an intense snowstorm that weakens the group. Inugami warns Chie to take cover, since her webbing can't withstand the extreme cold. Yui then asks what their relationship with Akira is, and the protagonist replies that they are friends and that Akira ran away because of confusing feelings. He says they want him to return safely. Meanwhile, Akira discovers that his ice castle has gone viral on social media through the stuffed toy, but also notices that something strange is happening with Yui, since he carries an ice bag on his chest that seems to affect his emotions. Yui enters the castle and asks who Akira is talking to. Akira lies, saying he talks to his toy when he's nervous, and Yui accepts it, though with some suspicion. Soon after, he shows the decorated castle. Akira gets excited, but is horrified to find out that the decorations are Inugami and the others frozen. Yui explains that he did it so Akira wouldn't feel alone and would have company there. In shock, Akira almost passes out, while Yui leaves to get mint leaves. Later, Akira cries in despair believing everyone is dead, but his stuffed toy reveals that it can still detect signs of life in them. This reminds Akira that Inugami is immortal, and he realizes there is still a chance to save them, as long as he can melt the ice in time. At that moment, the stuffed toy says it has a solution, but before explaining, the story cuts to another flashback. Yui taking leadership of the Snow Village in Akira's place, a decision made by Yuko, who considered him the less prepared brother for the role. Later, Yui completes his training and builds an altar at the highest point of the mountain where the Nula stone is located, a source of power so intense it can restore and intensify the snowstorms surrounding the village. Meanwhile, the women of the village act as hunters and live in constant conflict with each other, always trying to prove who is more skilled or stronger within the group. Because of this, the weaker members end up being humiliated and constantly pressured by the stronger ones. The less experienced girls, who disguise themselves and observe Yui, question him about Isama's face, since she is seen as the leader and most influential figure in the village, and it's natural for them to want to know who is the most beautiful among them. Yui then begins investigating this tradition more deeply, discovering that all Yuki-onna cover their faces with veils precisely to prevent hierarchy from being based on appearance. However, during this investigation, he starts being emotionally affected by the environment around him, as if something inside him is slowly being consumed by the women's emotions. Feelings like envy, hatred, and contempt begin to build up in his heart, and his only escape is returning home at night to talk with Akira, as a way to relieve all that pressure. In the present, Yui returns to the castle carrying the mint leaves. Taking advantage of the moment, Akira also asks for water and salt, since his plan is to try to melt the ice holding his friends. In addition, he understands that Yui is the only one capable of facing his brother and possibly stopping his advance. Meanwhile, Inari and Nobumaru arrive at the ice castle and immediately notice that the Nula stone is draining life energy from the surroundings, which is made clear by the complete death of vegetation in the area. In another scene, Kira waits anxiously for his brother when suddenly the protagonist manages to break part of the ice and free himself. Although he loses half of his body in the process, he then regenerates and ends up partially unclothed from the waist down, which makes Kira extremely embarrassed, forcing him to tell him to get dressed immediately. After that, once dressed, the protagonist reveals that he intends to go after the Nula stone. Kira then remembers that the Snow Village has a natural snow barrier created specifically to prevent humans from entering, something he had heard about before, but he can't remember all the details. The protagonist asks for help so he can try to recall it, since it may be essential to defeat Yui. He then apologizes for calling him useless and admits he realized there are many ways to be useful. He also acknowledges that things at the agency became tense during his absence and sincerely asks him to come back. However, Akira fears his brother might put everyone in danger if he returns, so he decides to lie and says he hates all of them. In a confused outburst, He claims he was the one responsible for freezing the group's bodies and tries to justify his words coldly, even as his emotions are in conflict. He pushes the protagonist away and insists he has always felt that way, saying nothing can change what he feels. At that moment, Yui appears and tries to freeze the protagonist again, but Kira steps in front to protect him. Even so, he says it doesn't matter what happened before, since he plans to escape with his brother to recover the time they lost away from Tokyo. Before leaving, the protagonist calls his name, but Akira avoids looking back and sheds ice tears as he silently says goodbye. He then leaves the castle alongside Yui. Right after that, the stuffed toy Nissan speaks to the protagonist and asks for help to finish the task Akira left incomplete. The protagonist uses salt to try to thaw Inugami and Chie, while also activating the toy's internal mechanisms to speed up the process. As this happens, he remembers Akira's words and is surprised when Inari appears behind him with a mysterious smile. The protagonist immediately becomes alert and suspects her intentions, but Inari explains that this time she is not after the vital stone, but rather Yui's Nula stone. She then proposes a temporary alliance, stating that this stone has an important connection to the protagonist's parents. Paralleling this, the twins walk through the forest while another flashback of Yui is shown. In it, they cross the snowy village and Akira asks if his brother can help him with the responsibilities of being a leader. Yui replies that he can handle pain and hardship better, and therefore he should keep smiling, since his pure heart is what helped him overcome everything so far. Akira, in turn, says he is not as pure as he seems and awkwardly reveals an embarrassing incident from the past. Yui misinterprets the situation and realizes the difference between them is greater than he imagined. Later, Yui confronts the women of the village and proposes an extreme deal. He would allow their needs to be met if his brother could leave safely. He even threatens to take his own life if the proposal is not accepted. Faced with this, the women agree in order to preserve the tribe's continuity. A few days later, Yui says goodbye to Akira and sends him to Tokyo to look for Inugami. However, that night he discovers that some of the women plan to send an assassin after Akira. Enraged, he confronts Isame, but is restrained by the others. Isame then reminds him that he never promised Akira's safety, only his departure from the village. With no alternatives, Yui breaks free and decides to leave the village forever. In the present, he keeps Akira trapped inside an ice cage when he senses an approaching presence. At that moment, Nobumaru appears before them, and Yui questions his connection to Akira. Nobumaru replies that he is just a stranger, which leads Yui to attack immediately, although the strike is evaded. Even so, the fight escalates as Nobumaru reveals his transformation and engages Yui directly. Meanwhile, Inari tries to convince the protagonist to accompany her in search of the Nula stone. He hesitates, worried about Inugami and Chie, but Inugami uses Miai's stuffed toy Nissan to authorize the mission and form a temporary alliance with Inari. Thus, he orders the protagonist to go save Akira and recover the Nula stone. The protagonist agrees and heads toward the forest. Inari observes Inugami's trust with some surprise and teases him, saying he has become weaker by taking care of children. But the detective replies that his goal was never to be the strongest. This irritates Inari, who decides to act more strategically to prove her point. Meanwhile, Nobumaru creates multiple clones to confuse Yui, but the enemy responds with massive ice attacks that destroy the copies. The real Nobumaru manages to escape at the last second and counterattacks, while Yui also responds with full force. Yui launches a counterattack and fires multiple ice spears in an attempt to eliminate the Kitsune. However, the protagonist arrives in time and destroys the attacks, shattering the ice mid-air before they reach the target. Nobumaru then explains that they need to take Yui down in order to capture him and obtain the Stone of Life, but they will have to get close without being frozen. When asked for a plan, he says he has had a genius idea, turning the protagonist into a kind of living torch. According to him, thanks to his regeneration and lack of pain, the protagonist's body can serve as fuel. He even nicknames the strategy Kanebasado, allowing the protagonist to advance directly toward Yui. With this technique, the protagonist manages to break through Yui's energy barrier, causing the surrounding ice to begin melting. However, the Nula stone reacts immediately, creating an ice armor that adapts Yui's defense to the new attack. In the middle of the intense clash, the impact between fire and ice generates a thick mist that covers the entire forest. Akira takes advantage of the mist and uses the condensed water to form an ice bomb, managing to break the cage he was trapped in. Meanwhile, the protagonist's body begins to fail due to the intensity of the battle. He then asks Nobumaru to increase the flames even further to finish Yui. The Kitsune, however, refuses, explaining that if the combustion is pushed to its limit, his regeneration will be interrupted and his body may completely disintegrate, resulting in permanent death. Still, the protagonist insists that he can endure a few more seconds to land the decisive blow. Nobumaru, impressed by his determination, returns to his Kitsune form and decides to use all his power to turn him into a true flaming meteor. In this form, the protagonist manages to strike Yui with 2 devastating impacts, staggering him. However, before the final blow, Akira jumps in front and screams for him to stop. The protagonist hesitates and halts the attack to avoid hitting his friend. And in that instant, his body begins to fall apart before everyone's eyes. Yui then grabs Akira by the face and scolds him for escaping. Even in shock, Akira keeps trying to pull out the stone, now in tears as he understands his brother's sacrifice to save him. The protagonist, gathering his last strength, says he won't allow Yui to die. He then spits his life stone onto the Nula stone, and both immediately react, merging and separating from Yui's chest. With that, the ice castle begins to collapse within seconds, and Yui finally regains consciousness, while the 2 stones remain fused on the ground. Inari appears shortly after and collects the fused relics, revealing that the life stone is capable of neutralizing the power of the Nula stone. This suggests that everything that happened may have been part of her own plan. Inugami and Chiai arrive soon after and confront her, saying she cannot simply take the stone. Inari responds that, the moment the 2 relics fused, their individual identities cease to exist. Still, Inugami explains that the Nula stone belongs to the survivors of the snow village and that it is also connected to the protagonist. Given this, Inari steps back and hands the stone over to the group, choosing to avoid a larger conflict. Before leaving, she says goodbye and calls Nobumaru to follow her. The protagonist then tries to convince her to stay at Inugami's agency, where she could recover, but she refuses and says she must carry her own consequences as punishment for her naivety. Later, the group takes Yui to Ohana's clinic for treatment. Meanwhile, Akira waits outside the room, trying to gather the courage to speak with his brother. When he finally does, the 2 have an honest conversation. Akira apologizes and admits he lied to protect him and others, but says he wants to stay by his side as a friend. After that, Inugami confronts Yui and asks if it is true that the snow village was destroyed. He confirms it, explaining that he used the power of the Nula stone to completely erase it. The protagonist then asks about the origin of the relic, trying to find clues about his parents. Yui responds that the history of the snow village dates back 1,000 years and that the Nula stone existed since its foundation. He explains that the village was created to protect the stone after the Kemono incident, an ancient war between humans and Kemonos that devastated the world, leaving uninhabitable lands and thousands dead on both sides. To prevent it from happening again, Kemonos used their powers to restore balance and establish coexistence. However, to maintain this peace, Kemono stones emerged relics created from the power of legendary ancestors, passed down through generations. Yui concludes that if the protagonist inherited one of these stones, it means one of his parents belongs to an extremely important lineage. Inugami adds that there are other stones scattered across Japan, each tied to powerful Kemono families or dynasties, suggesting that the protagonist's origin is far more significant than he imagined. He then proposes that everyone begin a journey to find the clue that will solve the mystery of how the Nula stone ended up in the hands of the protagonist's parents. At the same time, Inari reveals that Nobumaru has not abandoned his goal of obtaining the life stones, but now intends to act more discreetly and indirectly, avoiding direct confrontation with Inugami. Nobumaru replies that he already has the right contacts to carry out this plan through third parties. Meanwhile, Yui hands the protagonist the 2 fused stones and says it is the least he can do to make up for everything that happened. Meanwhile, Nobumaru goes to a park and receives a new mission from director Inari via Kon to gain the protagonist's trust in order to obtain the life stone. More directly, he must make the protagonist fall in love with him to achieve this goal. As a reward, Akira once again asks Mijai to repair his stuffed toy, Misan, which was destroyed during the previous battle. After that, Akira packs his things and sets off on a journey of self-discovery alongside Yui. Meanwhile, the protagonist and Inugami begin their plan to uncover the whereabouts of his parents. To do so, they must travel to Shikoku, the detective's hometown, where there is a possible bearer of another stone that may be the key to the next step of the investigation, but are surprised by Kei, who appears and says she wants to accompany them to Shikoku because she heard there is good food in the region. The protagonist is confused about how she found out about the trip, and Inugami concludes she was likely sent by Inari to monitor them. Even so, he allows her to join, though he warns that all expenses will be charged directly to Inari. Then Inugami reinforces that the protagonist is finally closer to fulfilling his promise of discovering the truth about his parents. With that, the group departs, leaving Tokyo behind and beginning a new chapter of the story, thus marking the end of the anime.